Okay, well, welcome back to our three-part series on the ministry of Paul as seen in the testimony of his letters. This is going to be the second part, and we're going to be focusing on how did Paul do his ministry. And the things that I will be having us focus on in terms of the topics covered, I mentioned this in the first time we had our study. But for part two, who were the churches he wrote to? And so we'll focus on each one of those. Where were the churches located? And so we'll get a chance to be seeing some of the history and geography. What individuals did Paul direct his letters to? And who did he send greetings to in his letters and why? So let me just go in and skip forward to our content for the second focus here. And how did Paul do his ministry? So Paul's ministry approach was to work through other individuals. He worked with and through others. There is a wonderful movie, Paul, the Apostle of Christ, and a lot of the imagery that I'm using is directly from that movie. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend that you do that. He would evangelize wherever possible and use the context of what was there to help him out. He planted new churches. This was a key to his ministry. He would raise new leaders and invest time and train those leaders. And finally, he sought to create a church structure. And so that's something that we definitely see in the context of his efforts. And so this discussion, we're going to get into that in more detail. And so this is a map that shows all of the Roman Empire in its three main areas, the senatorial provinces where they had a senator that would be represented in Rome. The next would be the imperial provinces where Caesar appointed governors. And so this is not like here in the US where we have senators for every state. There would only be senators for certain locales. And finally, there were client states where they were Roman controlled. Bringing that in a little bit further for what we're going to be talking about in this series, here we see the setting of Acts that is going around this main area. This is the focus in terms of what was taking place both in Asia and Europe. And then we have also in the Palestine area, mostly focusing on Jerusalem. So those are the main things that we'll be seeing. And you'll see a map that kind of looks like this a lot as we move through this set of material. So Paul had three missionary journeys. We can see how they gradually got longer each time. And so he had his ministry headquarters in Antioch, as I mentioned, not to be confused that there's another Antioch here in Galatia. So we have to be thinking about that. So his first missionary trip focused around some of the areas that he would be familiar with. I'm not going to focus this on too much detail. Then going out to a larger extent, having a land travel around, going through a lot of different churches and eventually heading back to Caesarea and finally Jerusalem in a second journey. And then in this third one, heading inland on land, going out, retracing the steps, and finally being in Mysia and then heading back to Tyre and ultimately headed back down to Jerusalem. So those are what we have for a little bit of context for what Paul was thinking about and how he was trying to minister and spend time in each one of these churches. So who did Paul write his letters to? We see individuals like the pastoral letters to Timothy, to Titus. Philemon was also a personal letter. He had a pastoral way of talking to Timothy and Titus. He had specific churches that he was writing to, and sometimes it was multiple churches. And finally, a province. Galatia is an example where it's like saying writing to the state of California or something like that. It's interesting also to be looking at the author combination in Paul's letter. 7 of them are only written by Paul, but then we see these other people that Paul is bringing into his ministry, including the coordination and finalizing the letters. Paul and Timothy, there's 2 of them that they're written together, one of them with Paul and Sosthenes, and finally Paul, Silas, and Timothy is the author for 2 of those letters. So we'll be thinking about that as we start to do a quick survey. This is looking at that now in more detail. Romans, it's written by Paul, and he's writing to all those beloved of God in Rome, church that he hadn't been to at that time when he wrote this letter. First Corinthians, it's Paul, and he's writing to the church of God in Corinth. Second Corinthians, it's Paul again by himself writing to the church which is in Corinth. Here, once again, we have a name of a province or a state. And so this gives us like saying that here's a church that's in the state of California, Arizona, or something like that. And finally, Paul wrote Galatians as well as Ephesians. And so we have Galatians, it's to the churches of Galatia, and here to Ephesians, it's the saints who are in Ephesus, or the church at Ephesus. Then moving on to where we have Philippians, where it's Paul and Timothy writing to Philippi. Colossians, it's now once again Paul is writing this along with Timothy, and they're writing to those who are in Colossae. First Thessalonians, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and we see this for both First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians. Those are the writers there. Then to Paul, it's a personal letter to Timothy, so it's a one-to-one type of letter. Second Timothy is the same thing, Paul to Timothy. Titus, the same thing, it's Paul to Titus. But then we have this letter to Philemon, and it's to Philemon, but even in the beginning of the letter, he talks about, I apologize, it's Paul and Timothy writing this letter, and then that he's sending it to Philemon, but he also mentioned all of these other peoples as well as the church in his house. So it's nice to see the context of what he's trying to bring out there. So we're going to have a one chart summary for each of these churches. And so here, Paul likely wrote this when he was in Corinth, and it was an epicenter of the Roman Empire. So that was the capital. So Roma or Rome was definitely in terms of the political framework, that was something that was key. So this is how it looks. And so maybe some of you have been to Italy, and so you have an idea of what that is like. And then for each of these letters, another thing that I wanted to explore was who was Paul trying to write to. And so he had not been to Rome, and yet he's having all of these individuals, all these touch points that he's trying to address with his letter. Unfortunately, due to time, I'm not going to be going through this in detail, but just mention that there's a huge number of individuals that he's trying to coordinate with to the church at Rome. Okay, now we're in Corinth, First and Second Corinthians, and so this is in the state or province of Achaia. So Paul wrote First Corinthians on his third missionary church journey in Ephesus, and so that gives us a context for that. And so Ephesus is over here, and so even on his missionary journeys, he's constantly trying to engage with the other churches that he's already ministered to. So then moving on to who did Paul greet in this letter, we can still see that there's a lot of individuals, not quite as many as we saw in Rome in the letter to the Romans, but here we're seeing that. And so he is talking about people in the churches, people he's going to send to the church. And so there's a flowing of individuals and things that are going on as a result of what they're trying to do. So that's for First Corinthians. Second Corinthians, Paul likely wrote this from Macedonia. And so instead of being in the state of Achaia, he's in the state of Macedonia. He's not in Ephesus anymore. And so that is where we feel pretty comfortable that where Paul was when writing again to Corinth. And so this is in like 56, 55, 56 AD, a few years after writing First Corinthians. And there's not as many individuals. He's writing to the same church again. He's talking about the people that he's doing ministry work, Silas, Timothy, Titus. And so mostly in this case, it's people like this that he's engaging with, but also trying to comment through the letter other individuals that the Church of Corinth would be familiar with. So now thinking in terms of Galatians, I mentioned it before, but again, this is like a letter to the state of California or the state of Arizona or the state of Texas. And so Paul's letter to the Galatians was likely written to the churches he had established during his first missionary journey. He probably wrote the letter from his home church in Antioch in Syria. And so this is his home base that he was at. And now he's trying to get to this large geographical area that he's writing this letter to. So that's the context for that. We have several times interspersed through the letter that he's writing to individuals. He doesn't have it all at the end that he wants to have greetings, but he mentions them all the way through it. So he's talking about Cephas or Peter, James, Barnabas, Titus, all of these names that you probably would be familiar with. So he's letting the Galatians know about these individuals that he's collaborating with as he's doing ministry. Ephesians, this is now focusing on a specific city where he had spent time. And so Ephesus was a wealthy port city in the Roman province of Asia. And it was a center of learning. And so definitely all of that, we see that it was a key spot. So Corinth, Ephesus, large cities, slightly different scenarios of things that were going on. And so he wrote this letter to Ephesus. And interesting enough, we're seeing this variation that in terms of greetings in the letter, he just mentions one individual, Tychus. And so that is the person that he highlights in this letter. Moving on to Philippi. So this is another church that is part of what is called Asia Minor. We may have a different view typically of what we think in modern day of what is in Asia. So this is Asia, this is Europe. So Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians during his time of imprisonment, probably in Rome. So this is the situation that we see in this letter, Paul writing this from Rome, now not being able to travel, but he wants to go ahead and report back to this church. So interesting here, he makes a few noted into individuals. Epaphroditus, he mentions that. He also mentioned those in Caesar's household. So the Praetorian Guard had come to know to the Lord. And so here he's not, of course, going to be mentioning names, but he's trying to let them know that even in Rome, the spread of the gospel has gone in all different places, all different sectors within the culture. Colossae, this is close to Laodicea, which comes up in the letter that it's intended for the letter to the Colossians to be read in Laodicea, and the letter to Laodicea, which you don't have, to be read in Colossal. And so that is an interesting thing. Once again, this is likely another prison epistle that he wrote when he was in jail at Rome. And so here is another church that is in Asia Minor. So in this letter, they mention individuals here that he's doing ministry, Tychus, Onesimus, Barnabas, Mark, Justus, and on and on, Luke, who is definitely a key person as we start to be looking in more depth at what we have in his writings in Acts and the Gospel of Luke. For now, next going to First Thessalonians, Paul wrote First Thessalonians from Corinth, and so this is one of those places that he spent some time at. And now, just like when he was in Ephesus, that he wrote to Corinth. Now that he's in Corinth, he's writing to other churches. He's writing to Thessalonica, which is in the state or province of Macedonia. So interesting, in this letter in First Thessalonians, the only one that he mentions is his partner in ministry is Timothy. Then moving on to Second Timothy, Paul sent Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on the church, and so he's sending the letter to Thessalonica, and Timothy is the messenger. So that's what we have here. Seen in this one. And so he doesn't mention anybody, but I just highlighted the fact that he's writing this greeting with his own hand. And so we don't know what his thorn in the flesh is, but some speculate that it was vision, and so that he had difficulty writing, and so it would be characteristically larger than the other way it would be in the manuscripts. Okay, now we get into the pastoral epistles. First is First Timothy, and Paul likely wrote First Timothy during a fourth missionary journey not recorded in the books of Acts. So even though we have three, he still was active in ministry. And so this is the context we have for that. So in his letter to Timothy, a personal letter, he's mostly focused on him, but he also mentioned a couple individuals that were helping them and then turned against their work. And so as a pastoral epistle, he's trying to help Timothy to be thinking of the individuals that are people you could be working with, as well as people that you have to be careful of. Then in Second Timothy, we have this farewell letter. This son of Paul, he'd like to give him an affectionate way of thinking of his spiritual son. And so coming towards the end of his life, he knows that where things are at. And so he's writing this epistle to be bidding him farewell. And this one, there's all kinds of folks that are mentioned in the context of ministry. And so this would be helpful as he's trying to pass on Paul's network that he had in his mind to make sure that Timothy can go to that next level and continue on the work of what he's going to be doing in the future. Titus, another individual that Paul personally discipled, and so he was on the island of Crete. And so he goes back and ministers back in that church and the whole island. And so he mentions various individuals that are involved in ministry. And so this, just like he did with Timothy, is also trying to pass on his network and make sure that these are definitely people that would be good choices for elders, for continuing the development of the church and things like that. So a lot of information, and you can always pause and spend more time on some of these concepts if you would like. And so a couple questions that I had in mind for what we're covering in this section. And did Paul write his letters with the help of others? I think you can see that we have a clear answer that for that. In some cases, there was help. How familiar was Paul with the churches he wrote to? We can see that there's diversity. Some he didn't know anything about in terms of doesn't have firsthand knowledge when he wrote that, including what we see in Rome in his book, his letter to the Romans. So we can be thinking about those, and we have this interesting way of how we get insight into his mind and his network of churches, of locations, of individuals, and all of that. And I'd like to hear about what is your favorite book written by Paul? There's such a wide, rich array of things that are there. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this second study. So thank you very much.